fall, and from the ashes of their world, we'll build a better one!
So you finally research battleships, and you want to know cost-effective designs that you can use to defeat other players and other empires. Let's dive in and find out. If you enjoy this video, please annihilate that like button. Once battleships arrive on the battlefield of Stellaris, they should begin to form the mainstay and majority of your fleet. And this first design is pretty much the workhorse of any battleship fleet. This is an artillery battleship. Let's look at what's going on here. So, what we've got is a whole host of large slot weapons. Here we've got neutron launchers at the top, and then we've got a single X slot on the front. I've done the testing so that you don't have to, and I can categorically tell you that when shooting against other ships from other empires, neutron launchers are the best weapon you can have at your disposal in this large slot. This is going to be exactly what you want to have here. Neutron launchers have the longest range of any weapon other than an X-slot weapon at 130 range. They have a massive damage output, which will reduce the chance of other ships being able to disengage from the combat because they're going to be dealing so much damage. They will reduce the number of chances that enemy ships do actually get to disengage. They also have a fantastically large damage bonus against hull, which is what a majority of ships are going to be made out of until you start getting quite late in the game and getting lots and lots of repeatables ticking up. On the front of our ships, we've got something which is key to the versatility and power of battleships, and that is our spinal mount bow. So we've got here a Giga Cannon. The reason I've gone for Giga Cannon is I've done the testing on it, and before repeatables come into play, of the 3 X-slot weapons, those being Giga Cannon, Focused Arc Emitter, and Tachyon Lance, the Giga Cannon is the best weapon you can have. Because of the proclivity of shields to deal with neutron launchers are going to be the mainstay of your damage output, but they will struggle against shields. Neutron launchers have a minus 50% damage reduction against shields. So if you have in your X slot a Giga Cannon, this is going to do extra damage to shields, which will be the first point of contact with an enemy fleet when you come up to them, while still doing additional damage to hull, and yes, a slight reduction to armor. But from an economic perspective, armor is not advantageous to use. If you're using armor, that means you're using extra resources on your ships, so for the same cost, you will end up having less ships. So whilst, yes, you will find that Giga Cannons will have less effectiveness against armoured opponents, as opposed to something like a Tachyon Lance or a Focused Arc Emitter, the fact that they are using armour means they will have less ships than they could have otherwise had. And that basically makes it so that Giga Cannon is the best weapon to choose. Yes, you could use a Focused Arc Emitter as well, but the damage output from a Focused Arc Emitter is quite a bit lower. Whilst you are ignoring shield and armor, if you're coming up against another player, they're almost certainly going to have crystal hull plating on their ships, so they will have extra hull. And even if they don't, this is not necessarily the best weapon to choose. I have done the testing on it. The link to the video doing the testing is in the description if you want to check any of that out. It's also important to note that by using the Focused Arc Emitter, we would have to change up some of our artillery large slot weapons because it would be providing no anti-shield support. So we'd probably want to change one of our neutron launchers out for a kinetic artillery. That is going to degrade our damage output and the power of our fleet overall in terms of being able to do damage. So that, in combination to the reasons I mentioned before, is why before we look at any repeatables, important to note here as well that no repeatables are being talked about, but before we look at repeatables, it is definitely the Mega Cannon or Giga Cannon you want. This ship is going to have the artillery combat computer as well. We want to increase our fire rate and our weapons range, because when we've got increased weapon range, that means that our spinal mount weapon, as well as our large weapons, which have very long range, they're going to be dealing damage first against the opponent. We're going to get an alpha strike in, and we're probably going to take out a good chunk of their fleet. We're probably going to take out somewhere in the region of 20% of their fleet. If we get to fire before them, that is fantastic. And as I've said before, Giga Cannon, we're going to have a balance here between anti-shield and anti-hull and armor damage by having neutron launchers and Giga Cannon. These are the best weapons to have in these slots. In terms of our defenses, I am going to recommend you go for large shields because you're probably going to come up against neutron launchers if you're attacking other players. If not, even if you're not coming up against neutron launchers, if you're coming up against most things, shields are quite cost effective. Yes, they do cost alloys, as opposed to crystal plating, which doesn't cost any alloys, just a few crystals, and you get quite a large hull points added. But having shields, they regenerate, they are relatively cost effective, and I would generally recommend on this ship to use up all of your available power to fill up with shields. And then everything else left, go with crystal plating. That's the best choice from an economic perspective for defense. We don't want armor. It is twice the alloy cost of shields for the same hit points added, and it's really very, very expensive. Into our auxiliary slots, I'm going to definitely recommend you go with auxiliary fire controls. They're going to add +5 to your accuracy, which will bring up your accuracy of your neutron launchers to 100 and your Giga Cannons to 85. That means that as long as you're coming up against other battleships which have low tracking and even cruisers, your neutron launchers are not going to miss, which is really, really good. Now, of course, this ship does have one weakness, and that is it has very, very low tracking. So if you come up against corvettes or a corvette swarm, you are going to have some issues. But there's something we can do about that. This is the carrier design that I'm going to show today. All I would recommend you do is swap out your core from an artillery core to a carrier core. Throw in some advanced strikecraft. They're going to have quite high tracking and accuracy. They will deal very well with corvettes and any missiles those corvettes have to fire. I'd probably recommend going with Guardian Point Defense over the flak. Just personally, I think it's a better weapon. You do want to stop those missiles coming in, and your fighters are going to deal with enemy fighters anyway. And finally, Stormfire autocannons down here. We do want to have some high accuracy and tracking weapons, because basically the point of these carriers is to negate any other threat that your artillery battleships cannot handle. I would also recommend having them with the artillery combat computer here, as always, though that being said, you could switch a single carrier in each battle, in each group, over to be the carrier combat computer. This will increase the ship engagement range for the entire fleet, and that means that all of your other ships are going to be benefiting from the artillery combat computer, that extra fire rate and weapons range, but you will still get your fleet benefiting from the carrier combat computer. That's quite a nice sneaky move to do. With this ship, I would recommend, and I've done the testing here, you run them in 70% artillery battleships to 30% carriers if you don't know what you're going to be facing and you're facing another empire or another player. If you're facing simply artillery battleships, drop the carriers, only run artillery battleships. That's because you need to make sure that your artillery battleships are able to deal with theirs. Carriers are not as strong against artillery battleships because they're missing these 3 extra neutron launchers, which is half of the power output of a battleship. It's also important to note that these carriers and their fighters, when you engage the enemy, they will deploy, but they will take time to get there. Whereas your artillery weapons and your X-slot weapons, they will be firing from the beginning of the battle and the beginning of the engagement, meaning that you'll already have destroyed quite a few of the enemy ships with your X-slot weapons and your large weapons before your carriers even get to the battle. So I've talked a lot about the ships you would use when facing other empires and other players, but there's something I really do need to mention, and that is, what are the ship's designs we're going to use when facing a crisis? If you'd like me to make a video on that topic, please let me know in the comments section. If you'd like to optimize your cruiser designs, click the video on screen now.